Hi everyone, welcome back to another exciting Q&A session as part of New Masters Academy's 10-year anniversary celebration. My name is Peter, and I'd like to welcome to the stage here the wonderful artist and much loved New Masters Academy instructor, Rey Bustos, who is here to celebrate with us and answer your questions. Rey, or Mr. Rey, as most of us know him, is a California-based artistic anatomy professor who has taught anatomy courses and live classes with New Masters Academy for many years and has been an integral part of the student success here. So it really is an honor to have you here with us to celebrate with us on this milestone. So thank you so much, Mr. Rey, for being here. I'd just like to start out by asking, how are you? And if you'd like to give any extra introduction about yourself, feel free.
I'm doing great. You know what I'm doing right now is I pause as I'm looking at some of the names, and what's really lovely are some of the names I already know, like Celeste and Katie. It makes me feel so happy to see familiar names, like old buddies, even though we've never been in the same room. So I'm feeling good. You know, it doesn't matter how I feel before or after. During any time that I teach or uh, get a chance to share with people, I always feel good. So I'm feeling great, everybody.
That's wonderful to hear, and I completely agree. It's so wonderful seeing all of the familiar names from the live classes, um, and so we should, because when we take one class with you, Mr. Ray, we have to come back for another one. So
Oh, that makes me feel good. Yes. Like Godfather 1 and 2. You just have to come back and see what
it just keeps
happens.
getting better.
All right, everybody. Yeah, there aren't any questions I can't answer or won't even, at least won't try. So I think Peter has a bunch of your questions, and you could just put them in any order or whatever. It doesn't matter. Whatever comes to mind, I will just shoot them off to you.
Sure thing. So the first question we have, which is a good place to start, is what initially got you interested in art? And that's a question by Valway.
Oh, that's a good question. And I get asked that of you as well. It, it's interesting because whenever I get asked that, I'm reminded of what Picasso once said. He said, every child is born an
Mm.
artist. The problem is, most people outgrow it. And those of us that don't outgrow it become artists. So if you remember back, you probably would have the same trouble uh, answering that, because I don't remember not pushing crayons around or drawing or whatever. But I can definitely tell you that because I came from another country to America, I remember that in Colombia, South America, I didn't draw at all as a kid. And all of a sudden, when I was here, it seemed to be the universal language. It's the only way I was able to communicate. So it made it easier for me to kind of like become equal with the kids that I didn't understand what they were saying. So I don't think I've ever not been an artist, or maybe I wasn't born to be an artist, but I became an artist simply because of necessity. And I enjoyed it. It was the one thing I always enjoyed. And on rainy days when we had to stay inside and draw during recess or lunch, we got to draw. You know, the teacher would have like a table with all sorts of like markers and crayons and paper, and we could just go to town. And I still remember kids bringing other kids over to see what I was doing. And that's what the first time I realized that maybe I had something a little bit different than they did. Otherwise, why would they be wowing, over something I was drawing? Good question. But I think we could all answer that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That is interesting. I'm curious now. You mentioned that you came over from Colombia and you had that experience where drawing felt like a universal language or a way to communicate. I'm interested if that early experience in your life still impacts the way that you approach thinking about art today as an adult after many years of experience.
It's a part of my everyday ritual of expressing gratitude. From us moving from another country, which I didn't like, I came from a very pretty country, very beautiful area, to all of a sudden in the middle of like a crappy area of Los
Mm.
Angeles. So you think like all of the United States is this crappy, everything is sidewalk and concrete. But by drawing, it gave me like a comfort, like a big blanket over me. And it's a part of my everyday existence. And like I said about during rainy days, which aren't very often here in Los Angeles, but on rainy days, we got to draw in the classroom during recess and lunch. I still remember that my table happened to be, my seat happened to be next to a window. And I still remember seeing it raining, just pummeling the blacktop out there, and seeing the tetherball courts and everything just being drenched, and the balls were just swinging around as if two invisible kids were playing. And I still remember thinking that this is the happiest I've ever felt in my life. Now, granted, I was only like 6 or 7 years old, but at that time it's like this was like euphoria. So anytime I've either been in an apartment or bought my first home, I always set up my table next to a window. And when it rains, I jump out of bed and I go to that table and I draw and I look out the window, and it reminds me of that little kid that created the life that I have now.
Wow, that's amazing. That's a beautiful little
Pretty neat,
story.
huh?
It really is beautiful.
Yeah, and I think what's neat about it is a lot of us can have the same story. And if I were to talk to anybody that's with me right now, they would say the same thing. Yeah, I remember that this is just something that felt comfortable and it felt safe, considering, a child's life is not easy. And by the way, it doesn't get any easier. We just learn to deal with life a little bit better as we get older.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's interesting about you specifically, Mr. A, because I've always, as long as I've known you and witnessed you teach, something that I've always thought about you specifically was a certain kind of there's a particular kind of humility that you approach learning and artwork, and it does seem to be like bringing out of or rather approaching learning like a child, with a childlike sense of wonder and joy, I think. And hearing you say that makes a lot
I
of
think
sense.
that's the key, isn't it? I think that's a key, isn't it? For all of us to remain childlike, not immature.
Mm,
That's different. Childlike, and with that love of just being an artist. Not everybody gets it. It's a luxury in this world, right? I mean, not all people on this planet have the luxury of having that as something that you can do as a profession or something to do, period. You're just trying to
right.
stay alive. So being in gratitude is part of being humble, I guess. I hear that sometimes. It's like I don't know how else to be. I'm just grateful that I have this and I could share this with younger people, and hoping that you guys hold on to that and don't let anybody ever tell you anything else except being who you are.
Wow. Okay, so we kind of learned how art began for you, but where did anatomy begin? Dylan would like to know.
Oh, that's another great question I've been asked before, and it's very easy. In the 1960s, here in Southern California, and I'm sure many parts of the world, one of the things that us boys gravitated towards, and I hate to sound sexist, but it's true, the girls didn't really get into Marvel comic books that I know of. All of us boys had a stack of Marvel and DC comics. And when you don't have devices or things, that draw you away from what real kids should be, you live in your imagination. And comic books were just the best. I've never been a good reader, and maybe because I did come from another country, but I could read comic books, and I loved Thor and Captain America. And it got to a point where even the non-artists among us, we would always draw our own superheroes, and we would even make superheroes of ourselves. Yeah, I mean, I had like my own little character, and I had like a big magic pencil that I would like, bop people over the head with, and it shot out like lightning bolts, and it's like you just live in your head, and everything was activated by your brain. And that's how I got it. Girls oftentimes wanted to see themselves as princesses riding on a beautiful unicorn, and us boys pictured ourselves growing up and having big muscles and being really tall. Well, that didn't happen for me, but I could draw that pretty well. So I think that's how it started. Is like being fascinated with the musculature of these superheroes, and then it turned out that before Marvel Comics, Peter Paul Rubens had been doing that all along. 400 or 500 years ago, he was painting Marvel Comics like things. Everything was fantasy and superhero like. There weren't any real people in his paintings. They were all out of either the Bible or mythology, and that's what Marvel Comics is based on. That's why Thor is Norse mythology, right? And anything else like Spider-Man is totally created out of somebody's head is still part of like modern day mythology. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So there's this commonality between the arts. If you go back centuries, comic book art is considered new, but it's really not if you really think about those paintings from the Bible. It's artists depicting things that are very heroic. Even babies had muscles, for God's sakes.
It's very interesting how it seems to be this idea of heroism, and reading those comics as a child, seeing yourself in those superhero, those mythological type figures. Was your interest in anatomy always tied to the artwork itself? Did you always feel like when you saw that you wanted to draw that, or did the art part of that interest in the human figure come later? I'm just curious how those two things go together.
Well, you need that spark. For those of you that have electric stoves, you listen to that spark and finally the flames come, right? That spark has to be there. If the spark is not there, nothing will ever ignite. So for me, that was the ignition point for me when it came to like, what is our body? And I had a body. Right? I mean, we all have a body, and we get curious about it, and we look at our hands, and and us boys sometimes would look in the mirror and make a muscle and say, whoa, that's kind of neat. But I wanted to know what that was and why it was there. And then you realize that, those muscles activate a beautiful structure called the skeleton. And then you look at a machine, and it's like, well, there's something driving that motor, and the pistons and the cogs and all this. And all of a sudden you start realizing everything is kind of like has a commonality. There's something that moves something, and I think that was the thing that got me going, was like, what is all that underneath there? And I don't want to keep drawing it, because sometimes when I would draw the figures, intuitively, I knew there was something not quite right about it. And that's when I realized that for you to know what you're doing, you had to know what you were drawing. And one of the best influences I had early on was looking at the work of, I was trying to think of like Audubon. He was the naturalist that painted all those. He studied all sorts of birds, and he could paint birds very, very precisely. But if somebody were to try to draw that same bird or paint that same bird without the knowledge that he had, there would always be something wrong that bird people would see. You understand? So I'm drawing people. I wanted to draw people that other masters would know. It's like, yeah, that person knows their anatomy, because I could always tell the difference, even if you stylize. And more importantly, especially if you stylize, I can tell if you know anatomy or not. Surprisingly, the more anatomy I learned, the less realistic my figures became. They never became abstract. They started pushing towards the abstract. And that takes a lot more knowledge than doing something faithful, where you just learn to copy really, really well. That's a craft. The other is an art with a big capital A. Jasmine, I like the little muscle that you made.
It's quite a big muscle. That's great.
Yeah, I'm pretty impressed. Wow,
So
Jasmine.
yeah, that's interesting. Was that interest, did that happen before your formal education, or rather, how did your formal education develop that interest?
Well, that's I think there's just a trajectory. There was a time when I tried to push away the art thing because so many people said it's not a practical profession. It's not this. It's all the things that people have heard for
Mm-hmm.
centuries, right? Um, but it's kind of like if you know anybody who's gay and they try to pretend like they're not gay, it's like it just doesn't work. I'm an artist. You can't pretend like you're not. I know it's a weird analogy, but it's true. You can't suppress who you really are. If you're really truly an artist, it's going to come out, and you're going to have to come out to the world no matter who doesn't like it, whether it's your parents who start worrying about you and say, oh my God, you know what, you're not going to be able to make a living, you're going to live in our basement, all that stuff. None of that matters. When that happens, then you know you're an artist. So for me, I started thinking about where I could go, and it ended up being Art Center College of Design. So I put myself into college so I could learn more about this thing that just seemed so overwhelming when I was trying to learn on my own. And it was in Bern Hogarth's class, his anatomy class. And he was a world known anatomy teacher. And I got totally hooked. I thought, I want to know what he knows. And the good thing about that is, for instance, like I love J.C. Leyendecker as an illustrator. I could say I love him, but I know for a fact, this is not being humble or anything like that. I know for a fact I'm never going to be that good. You know what I mean? It's like I could have a little garage band and I'm never going to be the Beatles. And it's okay because you still do it. So I still remember thinking, well, I might not ever be as good as him, but I can know as much as him. And I did that. So you can know as much as your mental ability has a capacity for. The ability, you just deal with what you were given. You could get your level to the highest point that you can, and you may never be like a J.C. Leyendecker, and it doesn't matter. Most of us don't, and we make a good living. So that was my experience with that. Yes, it was through Bern Hogarth's class and having all these other classes like perspective, which I love. I loved everything about everything that I was learning. Color harmony in some classes, painting in other classes, anatomy in his class, and I just got hooked. So people say, oh, no wonder you know so much anatomy. You took Bern Hogarth. No, you do not get that in one class. Believe me. You get hooked, you spark. The flame has to burn on your own for a long, long time. You have to keep learning. It's kind of like wanting to be a good guitarist. And you have this great teacher and you have him for 16 weeks. And if you become a great guitarist, it wasn't the 16 weeks. That was the spark. It was everything that you did after that. So always remember that this just never ends. People are surprised when they see me in a coffee house and I'm like studying an anatomy book, and I have an anatomy book, but I'm studying somebody else's anatomy book because it never ends. It's not that I need to know these new muscles that are coming out like every 6 months, like technology. It's not about that. It's more like how somebody puts that same information in a different way of saying it. And that sticks with me. And that's why Peter is always amazed that I know so much. It's like, no, I take from all these other people and I'm just repeating back what I've either learned on my own or what I've read. So it's nothing brilliant about me. I'm a very average C person in life, but I've taken my C kind of mentality and taking it to the highest degree that I can as a human being. And that's all we could ever do. So I'm hoping that that gets you guys all sparked.
That does get me really sparked, because it just reminds me that every project that you approach is just one part of an entire lifelong experience of continuous learning, which is really exciting to me.
And it's satisfying.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, so Daniel would like to know, uh, what prompted you to start studying comparative anatomy?
Oh, that's a great question. You know what? It's just a natural progression, and you're going to go through that too. The more human anatomy you know, when you get a good handle on it, and you don't have to have the same handle on it that I do because I teach it every day. You know, that's a whole different thing. To teach it is very different than knowing it, by the way. But once you get a good handle on it, you only need to know a fraction of what I know to be a good, competent anatomist. But the natural progression is like you look at a cat skeleton and musculature, and it's like, oh my God, it's the same thing. It's basically like not going from one country to another. It's not from going to a European country to China, which is a big jump in language. It's like going from Spain to Italy. It's like it's just a modification of the same language. Or I think it's even more like traveling in the United States. You go to Boston, and then you go to Albuquerque, and then you go to Atlanta. It's like it's all English, but you can tell it's like, oh my goodness, they speak really differently. So what comparative anatomy is just a tweaking of what we know about our body. Since we happen to be living in the animal that we are, human beings, if you look at the musculature of a horse or a big cat or a little cat, it's like it's the same thing. They have scapulas, they have a teres major and teres minor and the deltoid and pectoral muscles. It's fabulous. Look at Sia. Thanks for all the little comments.
Yeah, that.
Oh, let me I'm just reading
Yeah,
what
absolutely.
Sia said. A lot of times when you learn anatomy, your drawings become very stiff. It's because, let's say you're just kind of strumming and playing around on the guitar before you take any lessons. There's a certain fluidity there. Now, it's not good. I mean, I wouldn't try to come up with an album or anything, but when you start taking lessons, you go backwards. All of a sudden, the teacher's having you do scales and things that's like, well, I can't play this on stage. It's scales, right? But it's the foundation of the language that you're learning. So for a while, so the fluidity comes in time, because when you start taking piano or guitar or I don't care what it is, the fluidity is never there. You're not going to sound like your teacher. It's insulting if you think that you're going to have 3 or 4 easy lessons and all of a sudden, you're playing for your friends at the campfire. It just does not happen. It's going to be apparent that you don't know the language yet. So the stiffness, Sia, is going to be pushed aside with time. I know this because I'm speaking to you in English, for God's sakes, but my first language was Spanish. And believe me, when I first came to the United States, I did not sound like this. I'm like looking in my brain all the time. My eyes were always looking up, like there was an answer up there somewhere, because I'm trying to interpret from one language that I know to the new one. And it's not going to be fluent yet. And that's what everybody has to be patient for. It's like, I don't think people realize how much it takes for you to be a good artist, whether you paint or you draw. It's a language and it takes time, and you have to be patient. And those that are not patient, they don't move to the next stage of being a good artist. damn it.
That's wonderful. So, Valway would like to know, when did you feel like it all started coming together and clicking for you?
Valerie, that's a great question. I'm going to give you a really simple answer that I still remember that day. I was in my art center class, in a drawing class, and it was a figure drawing class. So the model would be up there, and I was working really hard. I was working really hard to try to internalize everything that all my teachers. I wanted to draw like Harry Carmian, one of my master teachers. And I mean, there's certain times when I would go up to his easel during a break and look at his pencils to see what pencils he was using. And to my dismay, they're the same ones I was using. I thought he had some kind of magic pencil that we didn't know about. And it turned out he was the magic. But anyway, so the answer was this. When I remember this one time very clearly in that class, when I was drawing the model, and then I was drawing and I was drawing and I was drawing. It was on one of those benches. They're called mules, sometimes donkeys, whatever. And I had the big pad, 18 by 24 inches. I was drawing. I was drawing for like 10, 15 minutes. And I looked up to look at the model, and the model had gone. They were on break. And I remember, wow, I'd never done that before. I was actually drawing without the model. I transitioned from needing the model to having the model as my assistant, not the one telling me what to do. So I remember that I hadn't realized, because it happened so gradually. It's kind of like watching a tree grow, that I was actually internalizing everything I'd been learning. And I finally reached the point where I wasn't looking at the model very often. When you're learning, you look up all the time, kind of like sheet music, and you're like staring at the sheet and then looking down at your fingers as you play the piano, and you go up and down, up. And then there's a certain point where you take that book and you just throw it behind you and you play the song. Got it? Well, first you play the notes, at the recital. But then when you play the song, that's when you know you're transitioned. You're not playing the notes any longer. You're playing the meaning of the song. I was playing the meaning of what I was seeing when I was looking at the model, not copying the model. And that's when I knew I just crossed over to a place that I can't come back from anymore. I got it. I can't unlearn English now. I can't go back to just speaking Spanish. I can't. So that's how you'll know. You'll know instinctively.
Yeah.
Oh, good. So Adam is saying what I just said, that as a guitar student, I'm enjoying the music analogies. And no, I don't. I don't play any instrument. I play the pencil. But I admire people who can play. But I have dreams of me playing guitar on stage, like this wild man, like like Jimi Hendrix. But there's no way I could play anything, But there's a kinship between good writing, like in a book. It's like, oh my God, that's really beautifully well put, and I know English, and that's a beautiful line. Or watching somebody play an instrument, Yo-Yo Ma playing the cello, Itzhak Perlman playing the violin. I mean, people just get it. It's like, holy smokes, that's like, they're not playing notes, they're playing something that's exalting. And that's the difference between good drawing and great drawing. It's like, that's at a different level when everybody can feel it. There's this this internal feeling that you get that is so powerful. It's like, holy smokes. That's why I like great museums, and I don't always like galleries. They make me cringe. It's like listening to 5-year-old recitals where nobody's playing very well.
Wow.
What's the next
Yeah,
question?
that's I really appreciate the analogies. I know everybody appreciates those, just the idea of tapping into some kind of meaning, as opposed to just, as you say, like writing words. Or playing notes. It's wonderful.
remind yourselves, all of you, that we're all artists, meaning whether you're a musician or a writer or a visual artist, it's all from the same soul in the same place. Some people, like Chopin probably couldn't draw, but I can't play the piano, but we could appreciate what each other's art is doing. It's reaching the same place of the soul of the person that's either looking or listening or reading. It's always the same thing. It's just we just have a different medium. And that's really important to remember.
Yeah, wonderful. So yeah, you've already alluded to this just in what you've been saying, but Alex would like to know, how do you recommend a beginner artist tackle anatomy?
Yeah, that's a tough one, Alex, because depending on your personality, some things might not work. With me, obviously, it was really fabulous for me to be at a school that focused on all aspects of art. And this was, of course, when everything was traditional before computers came around, so I was really lucky. And I was an illustrator when we had to paint on illustration board and paint really fast and with acrylic paint, so I could dry, and you could slip it in a FedEx envelope and send it to the publisher really quickly, to the magazine. But the way I learned more and more anatomy is I would take any drawing that I would love, like a Pontormo, or even, in those days, I would even use photographs of models as long as they were good photographs, but mostly art. I would put tracing paper over it, and I would have my anatomy books open, and I would just try to do the muscles, represent the muscles as they are in that motion. And that turned out to be my life's work, because then when I started teaching anatomy, I had all my students do that. And for those of you that have had my class, that's what your homework assignments are. Take a piece of art, whether it's drawing or painting, and whether it's digital nowadays or old fashioned, just trace the outline of that figure and transfer it onto a piece of paper and then draw all the muscles or whatnot. But I just did that countless times just for fun with a ballpoint pen, because I didn't want to think about erasing. I didn't want to think about I made a mistake, and then you keep erasing. It's like, it just gets kind of frustrating. It's like, no, there's always a new piece of paper being made somewhere on the planet. So there's always more paper that you can fill with these things. But it took a long time, but it's like I start really just getting it to the point where now that's what all the homework assignments are. For any of you that have my book, you'll see that all my students' homework is in my book, and they had to do all that with a ballpoint pen and then colorize it digitally and label it digitally. So it's a combination of both worlds. The world I live in, I made my students work with a ballpoint pen just to give them the discipline of the ballpoint pen, which they weren't used to. A lot of them weren't happy with me. I said, that's tough. It's like, you're an artist, for God's sakes. Take this drawing implement and draw with it. You can't rely on things that are forgiving, like a computer, where you could just keep redoing things over and over again. You'll never get better. Got it? All right.
That's really exciting advice. So yeah, speaking of learning with Mr. Rey, since we're at the halfway point, I just want to plug, there's actually a fantastic workshop happening. It's called the Ultimate Anatomy Workshop for Artists, which is a 10-day intensive workshop for artists of all levels. And that's going to be happening in November. So there should be a link coming up that you can click to have access to that workshop. And you should really check it out.
Yeah, and that's in Santa Fe, New Mexico, here in the United States. I've never been, but I hear it's, well, first of all, I don't know if you know this little bit of trivia, but for some reason I do, because I'm really old. But it's the oldest state capital in the United States, Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it's also one of the most beautiful places in the United States. It has the cleanest air of any city in the United States. Wow. There, just thought I'd give Santa Fe
even more reason to go if you'd like some clean air. No, I think it will be a fantastic workshop, and it'll be a treat for everybody who can see.
Yeah, and I'll be there live and in person, and trying to do what I can to help people and make it a fun experience.
Okay, so Celeste is asking, what is the most challenging anatomy project that you've worked on?
Oh, thanks, Celeste. Oh, okay. There's one that comes to mind now. It was on a Pixar movie that never came to be, but it was like a big John Lasseter project with Nathan Greno was going to direct it, and he directed Nathan Greno directed Tangled, things like that. Anyway, it was a big thing, you know. And I was hired to do an écorché of the giant because it was like Jack and the Beanstalk kind of a thing. It got scrapped like a lot of movies. You don't realize how many movies get shelved. You know, you go through a whole lot of work, and then all of a sudden, sometimes the movie even gets made but never shown. It just gets scrapped for whatever reason. So I was asked to make the giant, you know, like this big. I don't know if you can see
Right.
my hands. It was like 16 inches tall, 17 inches. So asked to make an anatomical sculpture of what the giant might look like. So it was really neat because I even had to go back to Galileo, who actually formulated if a human being were like 100 feet tall, what the skeleton would look like. I don't know if you realize that these old guys that you know studied astronomy or whatever were also just brilliant in everything. And he came up with a formula that is still used today that would make it so that a skeletal structure could sustain the weight of a figure a certain size without it crumbling. It's kind of like how tall can you build a brick building? There's only so much you could build on a brick building before the weight of the bricks themselves will collapse. That's why we don't have super tall buildings before a certain amount of time, brick buildings, until the advent of iron. So the project was challenging not only because of that was the least challenging part. To me it was fun, but it was because I had just had a lower back operation, and I didn't say no, I couldn't do it. So I had to do it. I had to sculpt this thing like in bed, and if you could picture an otter, so I was like working on it on my belly. Okay, just like an otter eating something, you know, floating on its back. So it reminded me of being an otter. And I figured, well, you know, otters can do all this stuff, you know, lying on their backs. I can too. So the challenging part was, you know, not only coming up with a logical look of a skeleton, because you can't just make it bigger. Got it? It's not like you could take a cat skeleton and make it really big like a saber-toothed cat, because it wouldn't work. It would break. So obviously nature knows how to kind of like beef things up and in the right places. So I had to do that. So that was kind of challenging enough. But the most challenging part was the fact that I had just had an operation and I was laid up, and they needed it in like 3 days, and I did it. And I was able to get myself I was driven to Disney Studios in Burbank, California, and I had a walker, and I had somebody help me bring the thing up, and I presented it, and they didn't realize I had just had an operation. But I think the story goes that John Lasseter liked the sculpture so much that he kept it.
Wow.
So he's like the only billionaire that I know that owns a piece of my artwork.
That's a great story.
Thanks, Celeste. That was a fun memory to relive.
Okay, Marquise is asking, how important is sculpting in your anatomical practice?
Marquise, I'm not a sculptor, so I I don't think it's not that it's not important. It's just that I'm gonna just tell you something that is, I think, interesting. I didn't know I could sculpt until I did it, and because I had so much knowledge in my head, it just felt easy. So my advice to everybody is nothing is hard when you know a lot. If you know anatomy inside out, I'm telling you, you could go out back, you know, and you have like a dirt patch on your property, and you just make like mud. It's like you can make something out of it if you're artistic. And I think that's the beauty of like working traditionally for so many years and just having to figure everything out and so many different jobs. And sometimes they're 3D. But I've never had a sculpture class. Back in the first time I made a skeleton out of Super Sculpey, it looked great. And I hate to say that, like, because, you know, we're talking about being humble and everything, but I was surprised. It's like, wow, that wasn't that hard. And what I realized is the hard part was already done. That was learning what the skeleton was. The rest of your hands just took over and just did it. So I don't know how important sculpting is, especially now, sadly, because a lot of sculpting is done digitally. But I really do like the fact that a lot of people still sculpt traditionally because there's nothing like it. It's really beautiful. And I think there's something about like a painting that's on your wall, not a big digital print. You know, there's a huge difference to me. I have beautiful artwork. You might even see it behind me, but I have incredible paintings in my home, but none of them are digital. I can't even imagine putting anything digital up on my wall. It just doesn't mean anything. It's kind of like the difference between like a golf game on your computer and actually going and playing golf. There's no way you could compare the two.
Well, excuse me. That's very interesting. And I was going to save this question for later, but I think it makes sense to ask it now. Since we are talking about, say, digital and traditional art, there's this whole artificial intelligence thing going on at the moment. And we have a question from Trixin asking, with the rise of artificial intelligence and its negative impacts on artists, especially in the digital artists, do you think that digital artists still have a chance in creative careers, like concept art and animation? And with this rise of AI, do you think that people are going to start moving back and embracing traditional art forms? If you have any opinions on that.
I have opinions about anything and everything regarding art or creative field. Traditional art will never go away. It's kind of like Chopin is always going to be good. There's always going to be somebody making pianos or guitars, right? There's no way. Can you imagine 100 years from now that for some reason, you know, we advance so far that we don't need to make guitars any longer? That's not going to happen. So the good thing about being trained as a traditional artist and being able to draw is that I'm always going to have a place there. I don't know what the future holds, but we couldn't have foreseen this when I was in college, you know, back in the 80s, early 80s and at Art Center. There's no way that, you know, I would say that I'm going to be teaching him, teaching globally without leaving my home, you know, or I don't have a cell phone, but it's amazing how connected everybody is. And I don't think it's necessarily a good thing. So as long as you can draw and paint, somehow you're going to always have a place. The same thing was asked in the 1800s. I just realized this with the advent of photography. It's like, oh my goodness, like portrait artists are obsolete now. Look at what a photographer can do, and like just having somebody sit. It's like, you know what happened is, yes, it did destroy the careers of mediocre portrait painters, but it made the great portrait painters better because they could do stuff that a camera could not do. And then all of a sudden, the other big, huge jump was like computers. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, nobody's going to want anybody who can draw. It's like, no, that's not true. I went to school with a man, his name is Craig Mullins. And he was great traditionally, and now he's great digitally. And if something else comes along, he's going to be great. If I were to snap my fingers like on a Bewitched episode, which most of you might not know what I'm talking about, but let's say magically I snap my fingers and Leonardo da Vinci was sitting with me right now answering your questions too, all he would need is maybe a week tutorial, and he would master the computer. And he would be doing art on the computer that you would not believe. You know why? Because that's the power of the creative mind and his ability and his his thirst for knowledge. He would succeed. So would Peter Paul Rubens. There's no way you can tell me that these guys would not survive today. They would just adapt. You know, Michelangelo lived long enough to adapt from the high Renaissance to mannerism. And he was a master of both genres because the power of his artistry is that big that you can't hold this guy down. So as long as you continue the traditional art, there's going to be a place for you. Yeah, it does scare me because I think technology is moving way too fast. It's too fast for humanity. Humanity's never sped up this way before. I mean, it was bad enough that, you know, in 1903, all of a sudden, you know, at Kitty Hawk, you know, we have these little biplanes flying around, right? And then 63 years later, 66 years later from Kitty Hawk, we're landing on the moon. That's fast. Now we're moving that much faster in a year. Got it? So I don't think we're meant as human beings to be able to evolve and keep up with stuff without knowing what the ramifications are. So I'm afraid for my daughter's generation, your generation, your kids' generation, because I don't know what that's going to entail. People could call you and you think you're talking to your mom and it's not your mom. It's some AI thing. You know, that's pretty scary. And I don't know, but I always feel like there's some way of balancing everything. And somehow we're going to neutralize that and slow it down or something, I hope. Otherwise, we're going to be in big trouble. But as an artist, is always draw well and really just grab onto that discipline, that old discipline, because somebody's always going to want to have something over the couch that is meaningful. And the only thing that's meaningful is when somebody's touched it. The reason you love going to museums is because when you're in front of a Peter Paul Rubens painting, at some point he was in front of that Peter Paul Rubens painting in his studio. Isn't that amazing? Or the Mona Lisa, that was like, this guy touched it. You know, it wasn't printed out. It was like there, and it had this evolutionary path, and it had this beauty to it. Anyway, so that's my little spiel about that. So just keep working traditionally, getting really good at drawing. You're always going to be needed somehow.
Yeah, that's really
At least I hope
inspiring,
so.
and I think timely as well. It's so encouraging to hear that from somebody like you, Mr. Rey, that it is the artistry that does transcend all of these changing technologies, and that it's happened before, and I'm sure it will happen again in future. So just staying the course, I
I
really
think so.
appreciate hearing that.
I just remember in the 80s with Culture Club and, you know, Boy George, and he didn't have a drummer. He had a synthesized drummer. And people just got tired of that. Do you know what I mean? Eventually somebody wants a Ringo Starr or a Keith Moon, you know, or, you know, Mick Fleetwood. I mean, there's something about like a real drummer than a machine. So it's the same thing. You know, it was like, I think this is the way music is going. It's like, well, it did for a little bit, and it went right back to just hard rock and roll and real drummers.
Okay, well, speaking of the Beatles and Culture Club and Fleetwood Mac, here's a fun one for you. Daniel would like to know, if you were trapped on a remote island with 3 artistic tools, what would you bring and what music would you bring? And I'm going to guess that it's probably not disco.
Well, you know, no, and you know the music because I love classical, I love jazz, I love American blues. I mean, that was the gift to the world from America, was blues, born out of black slavery and things. There's just, but if I only had one, of course it would have to be Beatles and post Beatles. You know, John, Paul, and George were just incredible writers, and together as a group, they were just impeccable. It's hard to believe that any group was that good. And one of the things I oftentimes say, it's like, you know, you're in a good group when George Harrison's the 3rd best writer. You know, I mean, that's pretty impressive. The tools are kind of easy. I would want my ballpoint pen. Got it. but the other tools are actually already on the island. I take a stick, burn it. It's like, oh, I have charcoal. You know what I mean? It's like, how did the cave paintings happen? They didn't go to Blick's, art supply store or some, art supply store down the street. It's like they look around them and they would make the materials. So the materials part is kind of neat because I would like to see what I could make on my own. And I would start with a burnt stick since I don't have like that much knowledge as to how to make all those beautiful colors that some of the cave painters did. But some of the cave paintings are exquisite. Some of them are bad, just like any genre. They're bad cave painters. Oh man, that's a hack of an artist, Crag or whatever his name was. But this other person, man, they were really, really good. So yeah, that's a Gilligan's Island kind of a question. But yeah, I think about that often, and somehow I would be okay on an island, and I would, as long as you could take your toe and draw in the sand, you're an artist. You know what I mean?
All right, that's great. Yeah, I completely agree. It doesn't get much better than the Beatles. Okay, so let's see here. Alicia would like to know, what has been your most rewarding experience as an artist?
Gosh, Alicia, that's such a good question and such a difficult one to answer. I really do think when I kind of crossed into a different realm, like I told you about the time when, I was drawing and I was just so full of joy. And all of a sudden I looked up and the model hadn't been there for like 10 minutes. That was like a really transcendent moment. I felt uplifted. I felt like I grew. I felt like lobster changing sizes, and shedding or a snake. Somehow like I became bigger and I became more. And after that, figure drawing didn't seem to be as much of not a challenge, but it didn't seem to be such a hard thing to do. It became easier. Never easy, but it felt more intuitive and I was able to just express myself more. I think that was one of the best moments of my life because it took so long to get there. I mean, besides finally realizing, I still remember the first time I woke up and I realized I had just dreamt completely in English. It's kind of like that kind of a thing where I transition from Spanish speaking person to English speaking person because now I was an English thinking person. And now it's like I was a figure drawer that didn't have to think about anatomy or anything else. I was just moving. My arms were just moving as if they were out of my body. And it's an exciting an amazing thing I wish everybody could feel. Now, unfortunately, with my neck injury, I'm back to like learning how to draw again, but it doesn't diminish the memories. It's kind of like I used to play a lot of sports and I can't really play those anymore, but I have the memory of being able to do that. And that's enough. I don't live with regrets like, oh, I can't do this anymore. That's so sad. I can't, jump the way I used to or play ball the way I used to. It's like, no, I don't think about that. I think about the fact that I did and I played well and I drew well and I will draw well again because my determination is there. But and even when I do my classes with Peter, it's like it's not always apparent that I'm not drawing well. It is to me and it is to Peter, but to me, it's like I'm drawing and it still feels good, It's like, people that sing, when I hear people go see a Paul McCartney concert, they still love it, but they could tell he's an 81-year-old man. He's not going to sound like 26-year-old Paul on Abbey Road. It doesn't matter. It's like the heart is still there and the music still transcends that little flaw and it's forgiven. So that's my advice to all of you. Just be appreciative because you never know when you're going to lose it. All of a sudden, it's like, I lost it, but I still have memories and I still have the ability to start over again. and get better again. I just don't have to learn all the stuff that you guys have to learn now. I just have to get my eye-hand coordination and my motor skills going again. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, for what it's worth, I think you are incredibly technically advanced. Your drawing, and it's always mind-blowing to watch. So I don't know what you're talking about. But again,
You're saying that because you like me so much. It's kind of like listening to my mom and tell me how handsome I am. So thank you again, Peter. That's
no, but
cute.
I think it's wonderful again that
I, I, I sense your sincerity. I
uh,
get it.
yeah, I think it's wonderful again that you reinforced that idea that it is I guess the humanity behind the artwork that draws us to it, regardless of, like as you said, Paul McCartney may not have the same vocal range he had when he was 26, but there is still the connection, that human connection from his audience as well, um, which is really 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 interesting. Uh, okay,
Yeah, I think it was. I just want to leave you with this. I still remember it. I think it was Matisse who, towards the end of his life, couldn't paint any longer, and but he was still doing art, and he says, I don't paint with my hands, I paint with my
mm,
heart. And it still showed, and his art got beautiful. It's just different, because he didn't have the same facility. So, and thanks, Michelle. I just read what you said to me. I'm sending you my love back to you. So thank you so much, everybody. Take over, Peter.
yeah, well, we only have a couple of minutes left. Unfortunately, we could be here for hours. There are lots of questions, but there is one here that I didn't want to get to, and that is
Sure.
Valway was asking, who is your biggest inspiration and hero, and why?
Well, artistically, I have a few. I've always really appreciated J.C. Leyendecker. Love Dean Cornwell. Egon Schiele is gorgeous. My teacher, Harry Carmian, is pretty incredible. If you were to think about like a current day artist, I think is just phenomenal. Much younger than I am, but it's Roberto Ferri, Ferri. Um, Obviously, that's a tough one to answer. The Beatles one was easy, but when it comes to artists, there's different types of art that I really appreciate, and I really do like, the ones I just mentioned. Dean Cornwell's paintings are just astounding. J.C. Leyendecker's teacher was William Bouguereau, and his paintings are phenomenal. So history is full of like amazing things. If you ever seen Michelangelo's David, it's like walking through the redwoods forest. You just look at this magnificent thing and just incredible. Or the Grand Canyon. I mean, but it was an artist that made David, and that's what makes it so astounding. It wasn't nature, it was like a human being. So I get inspiration all of the time, all around me. That's why I have a house full of art by people I know that are really phenomenal.
That's wonderful. Mr. Ray, it has been an absolute pleasure as always, and I found this conversation so inspiring, and just your joy and positivity towards everything in art and life, I think, is something that we can all learn from. And I know I certainly have a lot to think about. And you've been
Thank
here
you.
at New Masters Academy for such a long time as well, and I know that just personally, you've impacted me so much in my thinking towards not just anatomy, but art in general, and how to approach that mindset. And I think that many students there would say exactly the same thing. So I just want to thank you so much for the impact that you've had on all of us here. And I think that's an important thing to say because of this 10-year milestone. That impact will live on for a lot longer than another 10 years. I can assure you that. So I just want to thank you
And
sincerely.
I really appreciate. I'm really appreciative of everybody that took the time to be with us. So I thank you all. I see a lot of little hearts. So I know this is the new symbol everybody uses. So this is my little meek version of a heart. My arm is kind of hard to move around, but just know that I feel it. Thank you, everybody. I love seeing all the little hearts. I love you too. So thanks so much, and always stay positive. You know, it's a good way to live your life. There's always something to be grateful for because life is full of like little crappy things that happen all the time. Sometimes it's a flat tire, sometimes it's a death, you know, big things, little things, but every day something's happening. But every day good things are happening, and that's the things I focus on the most. All right, everybody. Thanks so much, everybody. And thank you,
Yeah,
Peter.
thank you so much, Mr. Ray. And just before we go, I just want to say that we have our digital campus and we have a fantastic Master Study Monday event that's going to be happening right now. So if you want to head over there and continue the fun, I think that's a awesome thing to do after this. All right. Thanks so much, everyone.
Fabulous.